Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Talking Music, the show where you get to enjoy long-form discussions with superb and fascinating musicians. My brilliant guest today is the New York-based jazz saxophonist and composer, Alexa Tarantino. Alexa, welcome to Talking Music.
Hi, thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. Now, Alexa, you and I have known each other for some time, but for those following this channel who are not familiar with you or your work, could you start by giving us a brief overview of who you are and what's been your journey through life that has led you to be sitting here today?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, it's so great to see you again, Samuel, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. So, yeah, I'm from Connecticut, not far from New York City, and I am not from a musical family. I just saw someone playing the saxophone at a young age and absolutely fell in love with it. And that was really the hook, and that was it. And here we are, 20 years later. I'm very fortunate to have had amazing mentors and role models throughout my jazz education, from elementary to middle to high school, to college at the Eastman School of Music and the Juilliard School, to then starting to develop my own education programs in Massachusetts and beyond, and then to ultimately working mostly with Wynton Marsalis and Jazz at Lincoln Center, whether it's touring with him and the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra or facilitating or working alongside them in their education initiatives. And I also tour quite frequently internationally with Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, Artemis, my own group, the Alexa Tarantino Quartet, and yeah, just looking forward to more music and more great adventures.
Well, that's a wonderful overview you've given us there. And there's so much I'd like to dive into, but I'd like to start with your role as a band leader. So I often find when you talk to musicians about their work as a band leader, there's always interesting stories there. And I was recently listening to your most recent album, Firefly. And while I was listening, I was checking out the liner notes. And I was looking at the dates and I was thinking, you know what, I think there's a good story here, because I have a sneaking suspicion that a lot of your preparation, your writing time, your rehearsal time, and probably a lot of your recording time, it will have likely had to take place during the COVID lockdowns.
Right.
Now, being a band leader at the best of times isn't an easy job. But under those circumstances, well, I'd like to hear that story. Would you mind sharing it with us?
Absolutely. So your suspicion was correct. I had released my second record as a band leader, which was Clarity. That was recorded in 2019 and then released in April 2020. So we were doing, a lot of the post-production and promotion stuff in COVID, which was really fine. That was fine. I mean, the only thing that really was affected was that I couldn't do CD release shows and really kick it off with a tour. But I did decide to schedule the next recording session anyway. And that was fall of 2020, releasing Firefly in 2021. And so that really just gave me something to work towards, something to write for, and which I'm learning now because I haven't scheduled a recording session since, that's really how I work best, is just scheduling it and making myself do it and work towards it on the calendar. Otherwise things can easily get in the way. But so for the recording, we actually rehearsed and recorded simultaneously because of the COVID precautions and the fact that we really couldn't gather in multiple instances. So I wrote all of the music. We had a Zoom meeting talk through about a week or two before the session where I had sent everybody the parts. We just sort of looked through, asked, first look questions. And then we had 2 days in the studio and we were all isolated for the most part. So we really didn't interact with each other too much, except for through our headphones and our microphones. We all arrived at our own times to get set up, type of a thing. And we rehearsed a tune, and then we recorded a tune. We rehearsed a tune, and then we recorded a tune. We rehearsed a tune and recorded that same tune, rather, so back to back. And we just chipped away in that respect for 2 days. It was interesting. It was really interesting. I would do it again. I liked kind of the crash course element of it, the fact that it was just like hit the ground running. And I'm really grateful to the band for being just so focused and so present after, all that downtime for all of us to just come in and really hit it. That's quite a skill.
And I imagine it must have been quite a challenge, particularly whenever I watch jazz bands, there's so much eye contact and that sort of visual aspect of it to what you're interacting and doing. I imagine it must have been quite a challenge where you can't see each other.
Yes, it was definitely tricky. I mean, the way that we were set up, I was able to see most people. I'm not sure that they were all able to see each other amazingly well, but for the most part, yeah, we just had to do our best.
Well, the thing is, it's a great album, and you wouldn't know there's that backstory unless you told it. So I recommend to all our listeners, go and check that album out. Also, your other albums, they're fantastic. They're absolutely fantastic. So check them out, guys. But that album, you can't tell that there were all those things going on, but I couldn't help notice it when I saw the liner notes. Thank you for sharing the story.
Of course.
I'd like to pivot from there to another interesting role that you highlighted a moment ago. So we've just talked about your role as a band leader, but you work a lot in other people's ensembles. You mentioned your work with the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra and the great Wynton Marsalis, and also Cecile McLaurin-Salvant, a multi-Grammy Award-winning jazz artist. I imagine working in other people's ensembles, it's quite a different experience to running your own. And working with musicians of that caliber, you must learn a lot in the process. So could you share with us some of your experiences of doing this and how you feel it's shaped you as a musician?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really one of the most rewarding elements of my career to work with other people and bring their music to life in the way that they hear it and they envision it. It's a real privilege. Because there are so many, saxophonists, woodwind players, side people in the industry. So to become a part of somebody's, musical family in some way is, it really is like a family, between the touring and the late nights and the early mornings and the cancellations and, there's a lot behind the scenes that goes into it to make, I think, the music feel as special as it does when you listen to some of those groups that we all love listening to. It's because it's more than just rehearsals and recordings, but there's a lot of life experience and relationships there. So that's really my favorite part about it is just collaborating with people. And of course, it's extra meaningful when you feel that your voice is valued and a positive contribution and means something to other people and that you can help and contribute and make a difference in a positive way. So people like Wynton Marsalis and Cecile McLaurin-Salvant are not only people that I look up to as artists and just citizens of the jazz community, but they're people who challenge me and lift me up and inspire me. And, they'll call me out if something needs to be better, if there's something's not quite how they're hearing it, but that's the beauty of it. So it's definitely taught me a lot in terms of how I want to be a leader and a band leader and an educator as well. And I feel very lucky to be working with people that I work with.
I can imagine as well, certainly with the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra, there's so many different generations and different experiences that will have gone into that. And to have that all as part of one musical family that you're a part of, that must be a very special experience when you're on the road.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. I'm sort of like the little sister in the group when I'm with them. And I feel really grateful for that. I remember seeing the orchestra play when I was in high school and really listening to their recordings a lot and really just falling in love with the entire big band tradition and the music of Duke Ellington and the role of the saxophone section and the woodwind doubling and lead alto playing, the art of lead alto playing, the art of playing stylistically and with emotion and feeling and meaning. So that could not have been, a better start for me as a high school student, just in terms of setting my sights on the type of player that I wanted to be. And so every time I walk on stage with them, I'm like, wow, it's really a gift to be able to be on that stage and think about, who's in the audience and who might be in similar shoes looking to, take their next steps as a emerging musician. And it's very inspiring.
You mentioned Ellington. Is that a particular favourite big band composer that you enjoy the repertoire of, or are there others that you really, really rate as well?
Oh, definitely. I mean, Duke Ellington is, the OG, one of them at least, and is still played and revered so much, in all the work that we do and that I do in various groups. Duke Ellington, I mean, from Duke Ellington to Count Basie to people like Maria Schneider to Thad Jones and Mel Lewis to Darcy James Argue to there's just so many incredible big band composers. And then there are people in my age group and kind of circle who are writing incredible music as well. And start just bringing incredible projects to life with large ensemble and unique instrumentations. I mean, I'm thinking about the Stephen Feifke Big Band. I'm thinking about the Charlie Rosen 8-bit Big Band. There's just so many amazing collaborations happening with big band these days. And every group feels like its own family.
I love that way of putting it. I'd like to now go into a kind of fairly philosophical question. I've always loved listening to jazz, and although I now specialise in the flamenco world, I still listen to jazz regularly. And one thing that really strikes me about it as an art form is, from a philosophical point of view, there's one really clear link with flamenco. It's an art form where tradition and innovation have to live side by side, often coexisting in the same performer. But here's the thing. I often find that many people perceive tradition and innovation to kind of be opposites. What are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think people, you're right. People do tend to perceive those two things as separate. And when you look at the tradition in terms of what was happening then, today's tradition was really like innovation back then. So what we look at as, when we look at Duke Ellington as an example of the tradition, what he was doing then was really innovation. So it's just the passing of time, kind of the circle of time of when people pass and new artists, come up, there are new eras and styles. Ideally, they're relevant to what's going on in the world, because art is meant to be a way to express yourself based on what's happening in the given times or what's happening within oneself and human experience and thought. So when people are holding on too tightly to tradition, it's like they want to freeze it and freeze the current sort of progress, freeze the kind of current creation and innovation and development. But if you can let it breathe a little bit and think about it in the context of history and what was happening in these people's heads when they were writing or playing, I think it becomes very clear that it all has to do with kind of looking back in the context of history. And there is that phrase, history repeats itself. And so I think if you don't acknowledge the tradition and you're only thinking about innovating and you're not respecting or you're actively pushing away anything that came before you, you often lose a sense of a core meaning or purpose or value. So there needs to be a balance. There definitely needs to be a balance. And so a lot of people have a tendency to think tradition's too old school. It's lost its touch, it's lost its sparkle. But when you look at the core elements of something like Duke Ellington's music, which were swing, blues, collaboration, communication, expression, all of those qualities are at the core of what people are trying to do now when they think that when they're innovating or trying to innovate. Or so I think it's a little bit like heady of a subject, and you can easily overthink it, but you do need a healthy balance of both.
I think I agree with everything you've said there. I remember once joking with one of my students. He was listening to a great flamenco artist from the 50s called Sabicas, and I suppose in the flamenco world he's kind of our equivalent of Charlie Parker. He kind of changed the art form in a very particular way and took it to a completely new level of virtuosity. And they came up with this wonderful comment where they said, "Oh, it's really nice, but it's just really traditional flamenco." And I said, "Man," I said, compare that to what a lot of the guys at the time sounded like. Nobody sounded like that. It was cutting edge. And you now regard it as traditional because it stood the test of time and we now recognize it as great. But you're absolutely right. It's that evolutionary process. And the idea that a player like Parker or Sabicas in the flamenco world created that sound in a vacuum without any reference to anything around them, almost like an ivory tower, that's not how it works. So I couldn't agree with what you said more, and I think you put it beautifully.
Thank you.
I'm going to embarrass you a little bit now, Alexa, so I'm going to offer you some compliments. And it's okay. I've thought this through.
Oh, no.
The thing is, there's certain skills and attributes you have as a person and a musician that I think anybody, irrespective of what genre of music they specialize in, irrespective of what instrument they play, can learn valuable lessons from. They're kind of universal good skills to have. So I'd like to unpack them a little bit. So I'd like to start with this. I've always really admired how focused and driven you are. You're one of those musicians who you kind of get up and no matter what the task is, whether it's a practice day, whether it's a rehearsal day, whether it's a concert day, you're focused, you're driven, you're in that positive frame of mind to give it your best. Now, that's not a given that that's going to be your default position. Because let's be honest, being a musician, working in the arts, it can be tough, physically, mentally, financially. So let me ask you, what keeps you focused and motivated to be like that every day?
I think it's the desire to always be better than I was the day before. Even if, there are some days where I don't succeed at that, but and not necessarily better at saxophone or at jazz or at music even, but just to, in general, be moving forward and improving and growing in some area. Because I do believe that, now as a professional musician outside of school, I do believe that, life experiences really contribute to our artistry and what we want to create and what we want to say with our art. So even if there's a couple days where I can't, get to that type of practice that I want to get to, but if I'm able to get out into, some fresh air and or connect with someone I haven't connected with in a long time, or spend a little time brainstorming a writing project, then it's worth it. So the desire to just always be moving forward is really, I think, the goal. And I'm always trying to be kinder to myself, in terms of if I don't meet certain measurable objectives. I often set, pretty high goals for myself, and it's not always possible to achieve everything in one day. But yeah, it's a balance of wanting to always move forward, but then also trying to be present.
And do you find, is that something that has got easier for you with time and experience?
No, it's not. I wouldn't say it's something that gets easier. I would say it's like you just get more comfortable with the discomfort of like not always, being where you want to be, or, not that I'm ever it's maybe comfortable isn't the right word, because I wouldn't say that I'm one of those people, like I'm really not happy being unhappy, or I'm not happy being unmotivated. Like if I'm not feeling like I'm myself, I'm really unhappy about it. I can't really sit with that. But I think it's like short game versus long game. So I think if you have the long game in mind, you can allow yourself some grace with some of the twists and turns. So maybe the answer to your question is a little bit yes and a little bit no. I think with time it might get a tiny bit easier, and with the experience for me, I'm always if I'm not on my game, I'm never like any less or more unhappy than I was the day before. It's just a blanket, like, this isn't working for me, I need to fix it, so it's a back and forth.
I like that. I also, you touched on something there that I think I'd just like to kind of tease out a little bit, because it's a really important point. This idea that I don't think I'd be very concerned if anyone came out of a practice session or a recording session or whatever it is and thought, yeah, I've nailed it. There's nothing I could do better than that. That I don't think that's a healthy position to be in as a musician. And you're right, you've got to kind of view it in that kind of long view, and also understand that things can scale. At the end of the day, you might think, well, I didn't achieve everything I wanted to do today, but you're a fraction of a percentage better than you were in the morning. And if you roll that out over a month, that's quite a big percentage better. And you roll that out over a year, and it scales and builds. And I think that's exactly the way to look at it. So I'm really pleased you mentioned that.
Yeah, I agree with you, definitely. It's all about the small movements.
Relating to that, I'm going to offer you another compliment, because I really would like to hear your words of wisdom on this, because I know everyone watching and listening can benefit from this. I think one thing I've always really, really respected about you, I don't think I've met another musician who is as efficient with time management as you. Now, that's quite an important skill. It may, some people may be listening thinking, well, what's that got to do with musicianship? Well, a lot. That is a very big thing. So let's put it in a context that our listeners can relate to. Let's say you've got some time to practice, and it doesn't matter how long or short it is. Let's say it's, 15 minutes, half an hour, an hour. What are your top tips for structuring your time so that you actually move forwards?
Yeah, I have certain categories that I like to hit in a practice session. So I will start with long tones. Well, I'll start with some type of a warm up, and that would be usually long tones, overtones. Again, it depends on how much time I have for that particular sort of tier. And then I will move into some type of technique. And again, there are sort of different tiers here. I try to play through a piece of vocabulary in all 12 keys. I try to play through certain scales, full range in all 12 keys, with a particular articulation perhaps. And then the third major subject. So warm-ups, technique, and now repertoire that is the third. And so I try to play through a tune, whether it's one I haven't visited in a while, or if it's one that I was listening to and didn't know, or it's one I'm just kind of messing around with in a different key or a different style. Always putting all of those things into context, into the context of a tune is important for me, because that's ultimately what we kind of go out and do. And then if I have more time beyond that, the other sort of tiers to get to are things like transcription, and also doing a similar sort of smaller structured routine on flute or clarinet or any of the doubles that I might be needing for a particular engagement.
So essentially cover a lot of bases and aim for incremental improvement in each one throughout the day, basically.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay. So let me ask a follow-up to this, because I'm sure you get this a lot from students. Let's say you've got a student who comes to you and says, I don't have big chunks of time. I've got little kind of blocks of time, maybe 10 minutes here or 15 minutes there. And I don't feel that's enough to make the most out of. Now, you and I, when we went to things like music college or when we're on the road touring, you don't have the luxury of 4 hours to practice. You get those little 15-minute blocks and you've got to make it work. So what would you say to a student who said that to you? I only get, a few 10-minute blocks in the day. How do I make use of them?
I would say that's perfect. You can... There's so much that you can do, and I think you'd be surprised how much you can get done in a really focused 10 or 15 or 20 minutes rather than an open-ended sort of few hours, at night. I like to set my timer for 10 or 15 minutes and have just one thing that I'm focusing on, whether it's major scales in all 12 keys or long tones with a cello drone or working through a certain lick or running certain arpeggios with extensions or something like that. I like to set my timer and really try to be distraction free. And with a few of those through the day, you can really feel, almost as in shape, as focused, as connected to your instrument as you, maybe even more so than if you were kind of just going around in circles and sort of noodling around for a few hours and trying to figure out what to do.
I think that's good advice. And I also like what you're saying about not being distracted, because I don't know if you'd agree with this. I say to all my students, turn the phone off. Mm-hmm. There's no circumstance unless you're the governor of the Bank of England, you're not going to get a phone call that's so important that unless you take it right then and there, it's a disaster. So just turn it off.
Absolutely.
That's great advice, Alexa. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'd now like to ask you a question that I like to throw at all of my guests, because it's a really nice way to kind of get to the heart of their philosophy on music. I think anybody who's ever picked up an instrument and tried to learn it, at least at some point aspires to be a good musician. Mm-hmm. But here's the thing. In order to achieve something, we kind of have to define it first. So let me ask you, what does it mean to you to be a good musician?
Well, it's a lot of things. It's a balance of a lot of things. It's a balance of listening. It's a balance of executing what you're hearing or what is being asked of you. It's a balance of having your own unique sort of voice or way of expressing yourself. It's a balance of knowing the history and the language of whatever, style you're playing in. And it's of knowing the history of your instrument. It's being able to communicate both verbally and musically with, members of an ensemble and work as a healthy and collaborative member of an ensemble. And I think it's also being in service of the music while also recognizing the importance of collecting, maybe not collecting, but recognizing the importance of the audience and working with them to create sort of that enthusiasm and that joy and that interest in the arts to keep them moving forward.
I think that's a wonderfully comprehensive answer. And I also love how you finished there, because it's another thing I've always thought is an interesting link between jazz and flamenco, because in the tradition I specialize in, the audience, like in jazz, is a very integral part of the performance. You know, if that atmosphere isn't there, it's flat. So you're right, it's learning to interact in that way, and that's a skill in and of itself. I love that. It occurred to me, there's a lot of things that you mentioned there, but I'm wondering if we often think of the title musician as a kind of a one-stop shop to describe what someone does, but in many respects it's kind of an umbrella term, isn't it? And I'm wondering if some of the things you mentioned, I would kind of categorize them in terms of artist and craftsman. And I wonder to what extent those two identities are important in the things you've just talked about and how they kind of overlap and intersect. What are your thoughts on that?
The artist and craftsman sort of comparison is a really common question in terms of art and music, because it's how much of your duty is sort of again, executing what's asked of you and being technically proficient and perhaps able to perform the same thing again and again and again, almost as in the example of like a Broadway show. And then how much of your, artistry and responsibility and interest in what you're doing is dependent on having your own voice and being able to create something new, again, sort of with meaning and relevance to what's going on in the world, and to move people that are listening and contributing to the arts. So, I mean, I think the craftsman analogy, would be something along the lines of perhaps a pit orchestra or series where you're really playing the same thing over again and again and again, which can be very interesting because it's a test of your accuracy and your focus and your stamina. So that's extremely important and a huge talent and skill for so many people. And so you need that. You need an element of that, because if you ever want to work as a side person, you have to be able to play what's called upon you. But then you also need your own level of the artistry to be able to create new things, to create your own things, to not be dependent on that sort of craftsmanship work. Where I guess the artistic example could be somebody who makes, the same chair over and over and over, whereas somebody who makes like one type of chair with just a few pieces, available, and then moves on to something completely different, or a completely different piece of furniture, or has their own particular style, even if they are making like millions of chairs. So, it's kind of the difference between function and the flair of it, I guess.
I have nothing to add because that was so well put. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Now, Alexa, I can't get a jazz musician of your quality on the show and not talk about improvisation. So here goes. Many following this channel are flamenco musicians or have an interest in flamenco. And as you know, much like jazz, flamenco has a improvisatory element within it. But I often find students of flamenco find improvisation intimidating. Now, granted, I fully appreciate that the improvisation you specialise in jazz is fundamentally different to the flamenco world, but I'd like to pick your brains on overcoming that roadblock. What would you say to a student who said to you, I just find it really intimidating approaching improvisation?
The best place to start is with one note and just improvising rhythms, in my opinion, because rhythm is really what makes music interesting. Otherwise, if we don't have rhythm, we just have strings of notes flowing and flowing. So I'll often, teach students a piece like a 12-bar blues, something like C Jam Blues by Duke Ellington, which the melody is only 2 notes, and it's a riff-based melody, meaning that it's one riff that you play 3 times in a row. So you can really kind of dig into it. And it has syncopated rhythms, which are indicative of, jazz. And you can take one note or those 2 notes and play through the melody. And then if you start to shift the rhythms and just kind of add a couple extra things in here and there, take out a couple extra things here and there, try putting a note here, try putting a note there, play 2 notes here, 3, 4, play a whole note, play a half note. If you mess with the rhythm, you start to feel the freedom and the elasticity there that you get when you sort of break away from the page. And then from there, it's about just getting comfortable adding in more notes and understanding which notes are kind of ideal to use, which are less ideal to use based on the harmony. But then as you get to a more intermediate and advanced level, you can study, the roles of various harmonic progressions and different concepts to use over certain chords. So different notes that work really well over this chord, but don't work so well over this type of chord. Or here's a rhythm that's really common and it kind of invites communication with the rhythm section if you kind of use something like this. And how do I play a meaningful solo over a few choruses? Well, think about starting with a small idea that you can develop over the course of a few choruses. And so you have to really understand the harmonic progressions, also understand the melody of the piece that you're playing on, and have the technical facility on your instrument at that point to kind of play whatever comes into your head. So you really want to strengthen that ear to finger connection.
I really like that, and I'm going to put it in a little bit of a flamenco context as well for some of our listeners as well, because it sounds very similar to an exercise I get many flamenco students to do, where you take a particular rhythmic form and you basically very much limit what you can do with it. You basically say, right, it's one chord, and you can play around with the rhythm, accenting the beats that matter, but you've got to stick with that one chord. And you can build from there. And I think you've raised a great point there. You make it as simple as possible to begin with. And I also like another thing you said, because this is something I really think people miss. When you're improvising, it's not always just a matter of adding more stuff in. It can be about making it more sparse and leaving space and knowing how to leave space effectively. And I loved how that came out in the early part of your answer.
Thank you.
That's really great advice, and I'm sure our listeners will enjoy thinking on that deeply. We've touched on some fairly heavy subjects. I'd like to have some slightly lighter ones as we're coming towards the end of our discussion. And I always love doing this one because it gives both me and often the people enjoying this who are watching something to go and check out later. The old saying goes, you are what you eat. I often think that from a musical point of view, we often are what we listen to. With this in mind, could you share with us some of your favourite albums and how you feel they've shaped you as a musician?
Sure. One of my favorite albums is Joe Henderson Big Band. I love the community on that record and just people from all different eras who were involved. I love Joe's writing. I love his playing. I love his arrangements. I love the arrangements that were contributed by various members of the group. And I just love the energy and the joy that's there. Another record that I really love is Charlie Parker with strings, for just the kind of the repertoire and of course the just technical facility and also melodicism and lyricism that Charlie Parker plays with. I love, trying to think of where I can go next that's a little different from there. I also love, there's so much. I love a lot of Wayne Shorter records. I love a lot of Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers records. One of the first small group records that I ever listened to was Cannonball Adderley's Something Else. And that was really influential on me just because of it gave me a look inside, all the different roles in a small group and what it means to work together. So I also love listening to vocalists. One of my favorite Sarah Vaughan records is, I think it's Sarah Vaughan Live in Tokyo or Live in Japan. Yeah.
Some good choices there. Some very good choices. May I ask a little follow-up as well? What would you say, if it were not your instrument, the saxophone, what's your favourite instrument to listen to, and how has that shaped the way you approach the saxophone?
I think I love listening to vocalists after saxophone because it's sort of like the next closest thing in terms of expression and connecting to your voice. I also really love the cello. I love, clarinet and flute. I guess that doesn't really count because it's still in the woodwind family. But yeah, I would say voice or cello, if not woodwinds.
Very nice. I'm going to hit you with a bit of a hypothetical one here because I think this might be an interesting way to get to know you a bit more as a musician. Let's say, hypothetically, you're on tour with your band. And you're about to go on stage. You're handed a magic wand. You can wave it, and that will conjure up any jazz legend who will perform with you and the band that night. They can be a master from the past who's no longer with us, or a modern legend. Who would you choose, and why?
That would be crazy. I think I would probably choose John Coltrane just because of the raw and like unbridled energy. I think it would be incredible just to stand next to that sort of force. And I would say John Coltrane or Joe Henderson, and Joe Henderson because of the thoughtfulness and patience and development in his solos. I think I would just sit there and watch.
Those are two very fine choices. May I ask, as John Coltrane's an interesting one because as an artist, he really went on a journey. Is there a particular era of Train that you really love?
Yeah, I mean, I think I love like one of my favorite records is Coltrane Plays the Blues. And then I also, of course, like just love the Giant Steps era. So I would probably, stay there right in the thick of things right there.
It's a wise choice. Yeah, I like that answer a lot. Well, Alexa, we're pretty much at the end of the discussion. But before I ask my final question, for those who've been following this and have really enjoyed it and want to find out more about you and where you're playing, where's the best place to go?
Yeah, the best place is to go to my website, alexatarantino.com. I would love to, see you all there or at a performance. I have I keep my calendar updated as best I can with upcoming shows, and I have some free download resources on there as well, and offer various coaching initiatives throughout the year. So you can go to my website and join my mailing list there, or visit me on Instagram. Alexa Tarantino is my handle there.
Fantastic. I'd like to close with a question I always like to finish with. Hindsight's a really wonderful thing. Let's say hypothetically you could go back in time and offer your younger self, your younger musician self, just one piece of advice. What would it be?
Probably don't slow down. Don't slow down. Don't let any, fears or insecurities stop your pace or your progress. Just keep moving forward and keep asking questions and just trust that, you're on the right path.
Very wise words to end on. And with that, Alexa Tarantino, thank you for coming on the show and talking music.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.